The air in Mexico City tasted different in the spring of 1945. Not because the war had reached its streets, it hadn't. Not because bombs fell or sirens wailed, they didn't. The difference was quieter, heavier. It lived in the pauses between radio broadcasts, in the way mothers held their sons a second longer before letting go, in the letters that arrived from training camps in the United States with words carefully chosen to hide fear. Captain Antonio Cardenas Rodriguez stood in the operations room of the Mexican Air Force Base, staring at a map of the Pacific Theater. The islands had names he'd practiced pronouncing: Luzon, Formosa, Okinawa. Places where men were dying in numbers too large to comprehend. Places that had nothing to do with Mexico, and everything to do with why he was here. The fluorescent lights hummed above him. Outside, 32 pilots waited. They had volunteered. All of them. When President Avila Camacho announced that Mexico would send an expeditionary force to fight alongside the Allies, these men stepped forward. They were mechanics, students, sons of farmers and shopkeepers. They were trained, yes, but trained for patrols along the Gulf Coast, for reconnaissance missions that never found anything worth reporting. They were not trained for this. Antonio touched the edge of the map. His finger traced the route from Mexico City to Randolph Field, Texas, where they'd spent 8 months learning to fly American planes, learning American procedures, learning to think in a language that still felt foreign in his mouth when he was tired. Then to Pocatello, Idaho. Then to Oakland, California. And now, finally, this, orders to deploy to the Philippines. The door opened. Major Jose Espinosa entered, his uniform crisp despite the heat. He carried a folder, thin and official. "They're ready," Espinosa said. Antonio didn't move. "Are they?" Espinosa set the folder on the table. "They've passed every test. They've logged more hours than most American pilots had before their first combat mission. They know the P-47 Thunderbolt inside and out." "That's not what I asked." Espinosa was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No one is ready for war, Antonio. You know that." Antonio did know. He'd flown in the Mexican Revolution as a boy, barely old enough to understand what the bullets meant. He'd seen planes fall from the sky like broken birds. He'd seen men burn. But that was different. That was Mexico. That was home. This was something else entirely. "They're calling us the Aztec Eagles," Antonio said. The nickname had appeared in American newspapers, a romantic flourish that made good copy. "They think we're symbols. Maybe we are. Symbols don't bleed." Espinosa picked up the folder and handed it to Antonio. "The transport leaves in 3 days. Manila. Clark Air Base. We'll be attached to the 5th Air Force, flying ground support missions over Luzon and Formosa." Antonio opened the folder. Inside were photographs, aerial shots of jungle, of roads carved through green, of Japanese positions marked with red circles. Intelligence reports. Casualty estimates. Weather patterns. Everything except the one thing that mattered. "What are they thinking right now?" Antonio asked, looking toward the window. Beyond it, the pilots gathered in small groups, smoking, talking in low voices. "What goes through their minds when they think about leaving?" Espinosa followed his gaze. "The same thing that went through yours when you volunteered." Antonio closed the folder. "I volunteered because I'm old enough to know what silence costs. They volunteered because they're young enough to believe courage is enough. Is it not?" Antonio didn't answer. He walked to the window and watched the men below. Lieutenant Reynaldo Perez, 23 years old, who wrote letters to his mother every night and never sent them. Sergeant Mario Lopez, who'd learned to fly by watching crop dusters in Sinaloa and now piloted a 4-ton fighter with 8.50 caliber machine guns. Captain Guillermo Perez Tegel, quiet and steady, who'd once told Antonio that he joined because his brother died at Normandy fighting for a country that wasn't even his own, and someone had to finish what he started. These were not soldiers playing at war. They were men carrying the weight of a choice that couldn't be undone. Tell them to pack light, Antonio said finally. Tell them to write their letters tonight. Tell them, he stopped. Tell them what? Antonio turned from the window. Tell them that when we land in Manila, everything changes. The training is over. The waiting is over. What comes next is real, and it doesn't care how ready we think we are. Espinosa nodded and left. Antonio stayed at the window. Below, the pilots continued talking, laughing, pretending that 3 days was a long time. He knew better. 3 days was nothing. 3 days was the space between who they were now and who they would become. He thought about the map on the table, about the islands with their strange names, about the jungle and the heat and the Japanese soldiers who would not surrender, who believed dying for their emperor was the highest honor. He thought about the American pilots they'd trained with, who spoke of combat missions with a casualty in their eyes that no amount of bravado could hide. And he thought about Mexico, about the streets of his childhood, about the smell of rain on stone, about the sound of his wife's voice when she said goodbye at the train station and didn't cry because she knew he needed her to be strong. The war had been raging for 6 years. Millions were dead. Cities had been erased. Entire nations had been swallowed by fire. And now, in the final stages, when the outcome was no longer in doubt but the cost kept climbing, Mexico was sending its sons. Not because it had to. Because it chose to. Antonio picked up the folder again and studied the photographs. Somewhere in those jungles, in those mountains, in those nameless villages, the war was still killing. And in 3 days, he and 32 pilots would fly into it. He wondered if they understood what that meant. He wondered if he did. The lights hummed. The map waited. Outside, the sun set over Mexico City, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, colors that looked too much like fire. Antonio closed his eyes and saw the future, the transport plane lifting off, the Pacific stretching endlessly below, the moment when the wheels touched down on foreign soil and there was no turning back. He saw the briefings, the missions, the targets marked on maps that meant nothing until you flew over them and saw the smoke rising. He saw the faces of his men, young and determined, and he saw how those faces would change. War was not a single moment. It was 1,000 small moments, each one carving away a piece of who you were until you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize yourself. But there was no other choice. The world was burning, and standing aside was its own kind of death. Antonio opened his eyes. The sun had set. The sky was dark now, and the stars were beginning to appear, the same stars that shone over the Pacific, over the Philippines, over the battlefields where men fought and died for reasons that seemed both infinitely important and utterly meaningless depending on how close you stood to the fire. He walked out of the operations room and down the stairs to where the pilots waited. They saw him coming and fell silent, their faces turned toward him like flowers toward the sun. 3 days, Antonio said. His voice was steady, calm, the voice of a man who had made peace with what was coming. 3 days, and then we go. Use them well. Say what needs to be said. Write what needs to be written. Because when we board that plane, we leave everything behind except each other. The pilots nodded. Some looked at the ground. Some looked at the sky. All of them understood. Antonio walked among them, shaking hands, meeting eyes, saying nothing because there was nothing left to say. They were ready. They were not ready. It didn't matter. The war was waiting, and the war did not care. That night, Antonio sat in his quarters and wrote a letter to his wife. He told her about the weather, about the training, about the men he would lead into combat. He did not tell her that he was afraid. He did not tell her that he woke up some nights with his heart pounding, thinking about all the ways this could end. He did not tell her that he loved her more than he'd ever been able to say, and that if he didn't come back, she should remember him as he was before the war, not as whatever the war would make him. He sealed the letter and set it on the desk. Then he lay down and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the base settling into sleep, footsteps in the hallway, distant voices, the hum of generators. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. Sounds that would soon be replaced by the roar of engines, the chatter of machine guns, the screams of men dying in burning planes. 3 days. Antonio closed his eyes and waited for sleep that wouldn't come. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, and somewhere across the Pacific, the war continued its terrible work, grinding through lives and nations with the patience of a machine that would not stop until there was nothing left to destroy. The Aztec Eagles would join it soon. They would fly into the fire, and some of them would not return. But for now, for these last 3 days, they were still whole. They were still themselves. They were still men who believed that courage might be enough. Antonio hoped they were right. He feared they were not. And in the darkness, with the weight of command pressing down on him like a physical thing, he made a silent promise: he would bring as many of them home as he could. He would lead them through the fire and out the other side. He would not waste their lives. He would not let their sacrifice be meaningless. It was a promise he knew he might not be able to keep. But it was the only promise that mattered. 3 days. The clock ticked. The stars turned. The war waited. And Captain Antonio Cardenas Rodriguez lay awake in the darkness, counting the hours until everything changed. The heat in the Philippines was not like the heat in Mexico. It was thicker, wetter, a living thing that wrapped around your lungs and squeezed. It made thinking difficult. It made sleeping impossible. It turned every movement into an effort, every breath into a negotiation with air that felt more like water. Captain Antonio Cardenas Rodriguez stood on the tarmac at Clark Air Base, watching his men unload their gear from the transport plane. They'd been in the Philippines for 2 weeks. 14 days. 336 hours. And in all that time, they had not flown a single combat mission. The war was everywhere around them, in the distant rumble of artillery, in the columns of smoke rising from the mountains, in the faces of American pilots returning from missions with their planes shot full of holes and their eyes empty. But for the Aztec Eagles, the war remained just out of reach, a thing they could see and hear but not touch. They waited. The 5th Air Force had welcomed them with handshakes and photographs, with speeches about international cooperation and the bonds between allied nations. Then the speeches ended, and the waiting began. There were briefings that led nowhere. Inspections of their P-47 Thunderbolts. More briefings. Training flights over friendly territory. Meetings with logistics officers who promised that combat assignments were coming soon, very soon, just a matter of coordinating with command. But the missions never came. Antonio watched Lieutenant Reynaldo Perez wipe sweat from his forehead as he carried his flight bag toward the barracks. The young pilot's face had changed in 2 weeks. The eagerness was still there, but underneath it now was something else: doubt. The corrosive uncertainty that came from preparing for battle and finding only more preparation. Captain. Antonio turned. Major Jose Espinosa approached, his uniform dark with sweat despite the early hour. He carried a clipboard, which meant more waiting disguised as progress. "What is it this time?" Antonio asked. "Another briefing. 1,500 hours. They want to review our readiness protocols. We've reviewed them 6 times. They want a 7th. Antonio looked past Espinosa to where the American P-47s sat in neat rows, their propellers still, their guns silent. Beyond them, the jungle pressed close, green and impenetrable. Somewhere in that jungle, Japanese soldiers were dug in, waiting for the Americans to come. Somewhere out there, the war was happening. Just not to them. "The men are starting to talk," Espinosa said quietly. "What are they saying?" "That we came all this way to sit on our hands. That the Americans don't trust us. That we're here for show, not for fighting." Antonio had heard the whispers himself. He'd seen the way his pilots watched the American squadrons take off at dawn, watched them return at dusk with empty ammunition belts, and stories they told in low voices over drinks. He'd seen the frustration building, the anger that came from being ready and being denied. "What do you think?" Antonio asked. Espinosa was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think the Americans have been fighting for 4 years. I think they've lost thousands of pilots. I think they look at us and see 33 men who've never been in combat, and they wonder if we'll freeze up when the shooting starts. So they don't trust us. They don't know us." Antonio nodded slowly. It was a distinction that mattered. Trust could be built. The unknown could be proven. But it required opportunity, and opportunity required someone in command to take a risk. "How long can we wait?" Antonio asked. "As long as we have to." "That's not an answer." Espinosa met his eyes. "It's the only answer we have." Antonio turned back to the tarmac. His men had finished unloading and were heading toward the barracks, their shoulders slumped, their movements slow in the heat. They'd crossed an ocean to be here. They'd said goodbye to everything they knew. They'd volunteered for this. And now they were trapped in a limbo that was neither war nor peace, neither action nor rest. It was eating them alive. That night, Antonio sat in the officers' mess, picking at food he couldn't taste. Around him, American pilots talked and laughed, their voices loud with the false energy that came after missions. They didn't ignore the Mexicans. They were friendly enough, asking questions about Mexico City, about the training in Texas, about whether it was true that some of the Aztec Eagles had learned to fly in crop dusters. But they didn't invite them into the real conversations. They didn't talk about the missions. They didn't share the details that mattered. And when they left to fly at dawn, the Mexicans stayed behind. Antonio pushed his tray away and walked outside. The night was cooler, but not by much. The air still pressed down, heavy with moisture and the smell of fuel and jungle rot. He walked past the barracks, past the hangars, to where the P-47 sat in darkness. He ran his hand along the wing of his plane. The metal was warm, even now. The Thunderbolt was a beautiful machine, powerful, reliable, built like a tank. It could take damage that would destroy other fighters and keep flying. It could carry bombs, rockets, and enough ammunition to tear apart ground targets. It was everything a ground attack pilot could want. But it was useless sitting on the ground. "Captain." Antonio turned. Captain Guillermo Perez Tagle stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable in the darkness. "Couldn't sleep?" Antonio asked. "No one can sleep." Antonio nodded. "The heat." "It's not the heat." They stood in silence for a moment, two men who understood each other without needing to explain. Perez Tagle was one of the oldest pilots in the squadron, 31 years old, a veteran of the Mexican Air Force who'd seen enough to know that waiting was sometimes harder than fighting. "They're losing faith," Perez Tagle said finally. "Not in you. Not in the mission. But in whether the mission will ever happen." "I know. What are you going to do about it?" Antonio looked at the P-47, at its dark silhouette against the darker sky. "I'm going to talk to Colonel Morrison tomorrow. I'm going to ask him directly when we're going to fly. And if he says he doesn't know, then I'll ask him what we have to do to prove ourselves." Perez Tagle nodded slowly. "That might work. Or it might make things worse. Doing nothing is definitely making things worse." "True." They stood together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the base settling into night, generators humming, distant voices, the occasional roar of a plane taking off for a night mission. Normal sounds. The sounds of a war being fought by everyone except them. "My brother died at Normandy," Perez Tagle said suddenly. "Did I ever tell you that?" "You mentioned it once. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was Mexican. But he'd been living in Texas, working construction, and when the war started, he enlisted. They didn't ask questions. They needed bodies. So he went. And he died on a beach in France, fighting for a country that wasn't his, for reasons he probably didn't fully understand." Antonio waited. "I joined because of him," Perez Tagle continued. "Because someone had to finish what he started. Because I couldn't let his death mean nothing. But now I'm here, and I'm not fighting. I'm just waiting. And I keep thinking, what if we wait so long that the war ends before we ever get to fly? What if we came all this way for nothing? It won't be for nothing. How do you know? Antonio didn't have an answer. He wanted to say that their presence mattered, that being here was itself a statement, that Mexico's willingness to send its sons to fight proved something important about solidarity and sacrifice. But those were words, and words meant nothing to men who'd volunteered to fly into fire and found only paperwork and heat. I don't know, Antonio admitted. But I know we didn't come this far to give up now. Perez Tegel smiled, a thin, tired smile. That's what I tell myself every morning. He walked away, leaving Antonio alone with the planes. The weeks continued. More briefings. More inspections. More promises that combat assignments were coming soon. The Aztec Eagles flew training missions, practiced formations, dropped dummy bombs on empty fields. They maintained their planes with obsessive care, checking and rechecking systems that didn't need checking, because it was something to do, because staying busy kept the doubt at bay. But the doubt was always there, growing stronger with each passing day. Antonio met with Colonel Morrison, the American officer in charge of coordinating Allied air operations. Morrison was a career military man, gray-haired and serious, who'd flown in North Africa and Italy before being assigned to the Pacific. He listened to Antonio's request with the patience of someone who'd heard it before. "Captain Rodriguez, I understand your frustration," Morrison said. "But you have to understand our position. We're in the final stages of the war. The Japanese are desperate, which makes them dangerous. We can't afford mistakes. We need to be sure that every pilot we send up can handle what they're going to face." "My men are ready," Antonio said. "I'm sure they are. But ready in training and ready in combat are two different things." "Then let us prove it." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "I'll tell you what I told the last 3 Allied squadrons that came through here: you'll fly when I'm confident you won't get yourselves killed or compromise the mission. That confidence comes from observation, from seeing how you handle pressure, from knowing that when things go wrong, and they always go wrong, you won't panic. How can you observe us if you never let us fly?" Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's the paradox, isn't it? But that's war. Nothing about it makes sense until you're in the middle of it, and by then it's too late to ask questions." Antonio left the meeting with nothing. No promises. No timeline. Just more waiting. He gathered his pilots that evening and told them the truth: they would fly when command decided they were ready, and there was nothing they could do to speed up that decision except continue training, continue preparing, continue being perfect. The men listened in silence. When he finished, no one asked questions. They simply nodded and walked away, their faces blank, their eyes distant. Antonio watched them go and felt something crack inside him. These were good men. Brave men. Men who'd given up everything to be here. And the war was using them up without ever giving them a chance to fight. That night, he wrote another letter to his wife. He told her about the heat, about the food, about the American pilots who were friendly but distant. He did not tell her about the waiting. He did not tell her that he was beginning to wonder if they'd made a mistake coming here. He did not tell her that every morning he woke up angry, and every night he went to bed ashamed of that anger, because anger was a luxury they couldn't afford. He sealed the letter and added it to the stack he'd been accumulating. He would mail them all at once, eventually, when there was something worth saying. The days blurred together. June became July. The heat intensified. The war continued without them. And then, on a morning that started like every other morning, everything changed. Antonio was in the operations room when Major Espinosa burst through the door, his face flushed, his eyes bright. "We have orders," Espinosa said. Antonio looked up from the report he'd been reading. "What kind of orders?" "Combat orders. Real ones. We're flying tomorrow." Antonio stood slowly. "Where?" "Luzon. Ground support for the American advance. Japanese positions in the mountains. Colonel Morrison signed off on it an hour ago." Antonio felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting and settling simultaneously. This was what they'd been waiting for. This was why they were here. Tell the men, Antonio said. Briefing at 1400 hours. Full mission details. And tell them, he paused. Tell them what? Antonio looked at the map on the wall, at the red circles marking enemy positions, at the lines showing friendly advances. Tell them it's time. Espinosa nodded and left. Antonio stood alone in the operations room, staring at the map. Tomorrow, they would fly into combat. Tomorrow, the waiting would end. Tomorrow, they would finally do what they came here to do. He thought about his men, about their faces when they heard the news. He thought about the relief they would feel, the fear they wouldn't show, the determination that had kept them going through weeks of doubt. And he thought about what came next. Because the waiting was over, but the war was just beginning. Antonio walked to the window and looked out at the tarmac, at the P-47s gleaming in the sun, at the men already gathering in small groups, the news spreading like fire. They were ready. They had to be. Because tomorrow, there would be no more briefings, no more inspections, no more promises. Tomorrow, there would only be the sky, the enemy, and the question that every pilot carried into combat. Would courage be enough? Antonio closed his eyes and felt the weight of command settle over him like a familiar coat. He'd led men before. He'd made decisions that meant life or death. But this was different. This was his squadron. These were his men. And whatever happened tomorrow, he would carry it for the rest of his life. He opened his eyes and walked out to meet them. The waiting was over. The war had finally found them. The briefing room smelled of sweat and cigarette smoke. 33 pilots sat in metal chairs, their faces turned toward the front where Captain Antonio Cardenas Rodriguez stood beside a large map of Luzon. The map was covered in markings, blue arrows showing American positions, red circles indicating Japanese strongholds, black lines tracing the routes they would fly. Antonio's hand rested on the pointer, but he hadn't moved it yet. He was looking at his men, memorizing their faces. Lieutenant Reynaldo Perez, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Sergeant Mario Lopez, arms crossed, jaw set. Captain Guillermo Perez Tagle, perfectly still, his eyes already distant, already in the sky. Tomorrow morning, 0600 hours, Antonio began. His voice was calm, measured. We launch our first combat mission. 8 aircraft. Ground attack. Our target is a Japanese supply convoy moving through the mountains northeast of here. Intelligence reports estimate 20 to 30 trucks, possibly armored, with infantry support. He moved the pointer along the map, tracing the route. We'll fly low, following this valley to avoid radar detection. Once we reach the target area, we'll make our approach from the west, using the sun. 2 passes. First pass, rockets and bombs on the vehicles. Second pass, strafing runs on any survivors. Then we return to base. The room was silent. Antonio could hear the men breathing. The Japanese know we're coming, he continued. Not us specifically, but they know the Americans are pushing north. They'll have anti-aircraft guns positioned along the route. They'll be expecting air attacks. Which means they'll be ready. He set the pointer down and faced them directly. I won't lie to you. This is dangerous. The Japanese don't surrender. They don't retreat. They fight until they're dead, and they'll try to take as many of us with them as they can. Some of you may not come back. No one moved. No one looked away. But this is what we came here to do, Antonio said. This is why we left Mexico. Why we trained for 8 months. Why we waited for weeks in this heat. Tomorrow, we prove that we belong here. Not to the Americans. Not to anyone else. To ourselves. He paused, letting the words settle. Check your planes tonight. Double check them. Get what sleep you can. And when you wake up tomorrow, remember, we fly together. We fight together. We come home together. That's the only thing that matters. The briefing ended. The pilots filed out slowly, quietly, each man alone with his thoughts. Antonio watched them go, then turned back to the map. Major Espinosa remained behind. "Good speech," Espinosa said. "It wasn't a speech. It was the truth." "Same thing, sometimes." Antonio studied the map, his eyes tracing the route again and again. The valley was narrow. The mountains on either side would funnel them into a killing zone if the Japanese were smart. And the Japanese were always smart. "What are you thinking?" Espinosa asked. "I'm thinking about all the ways this can go wrong. And I'm thinking we'll do it anyway." Espinosa nodded. "I'll make sure the ground crews are ready. Every plane will be perfect." "Thank you, Jose." Espinosa left. Antonio remained, staring at the map until the markings blurred together and all he could see was the shape of the valley, the curve of the mountains, the red circles that represented men who would try to kill them. He thought about his promise, to bring as many of them home as he could. He thought about how fragile that promise was, how easily it could shatter under fire. Then he turned off the lights and walked out into the night. The hours before dawn were the longest. Antonio lay in his bunk, listening to the sounds of the base, generators humming, guards walking their rounds, the distant bark of a dog. He didn't sleep. He didn't try. Sleep was for men who didn't carry the weight of 32 lives on their shoulders. At 0400 hours, he rose and dressed. His hands were steady as he buttoned his flight suit, as he laced his boots, as he strapped on his sidearm. Muscle memory. The body knew what to do even when the mind was elsewhere. He walked to the mess hall. A few pilots were already there, drinking coffee, eating without tasting. They nodded when he entered. He poured himself coffee and sat alone, watching the clock on the wall tick toward dawn. At 0500 hours, they gathered on the tarmac. The P-47 Thunderbolt sat in a line, their engines cold, their propellers still. The ground crews had worked through the night, and it showed. Every plane gleamed, every surface inspected, every system checked and rechecked. Antonio walked to his plane and ran through his pre-flight inspection. Control surfaces, responsive. Fuel, full. Ammunition, loaded. Rockets, armed. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. He climbed into the cockpit and settled into the seat. The instruments glowed softly in the pre-dawn darkness. He placed his hands on the controls and felt the weight of the machine around him, 4 tons of metal and firepower, built to destroy and built to survive. The radio crackled. "Aztec leader, this is Tower. You are cleared for engine start." Antonio flipped the switches. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. The propellers spun, faster and faster, until it disappeared into a blur. Around him, 7 other engines started, their combined thunder shaking the ground. "Aztec Squadron, this is Aztec leader. Radio check." One by one, his pilots responded. Their voices were calm, professional. No fear. No hesitation. Just men doing what they'd been trained to do. "Tower, Aztec leader. We are ready for takeoff. Aztec leader, you are cleared. Godspeed." Antonio released the brakes and pushed the throttle forward. The Thunderbolt rolled down the runway, picking up speed, the engine screaming. The tail lifted. The ground fell away. And then he was airborne, climbing into the gray light of dawn, with 7 planes behind him in perfect formation. They flew east, toward the mountains. The sun rose behind them, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Below, the jungle stretched endlessly, green and impenetrable. Antonio checked his instruments, checked his position, checked his wingmen. Everything was as it should be. The radio crackled. "Aztec leader, this is Overwatch. Target is 5 miles ahead, moving north on the mountain road. You are cleared to engage." "Copy, Overwatch. Aztec Squadron, arm weapons. Follow my lead." Antonio flipped the switches. The rockets went live. The bombs were ready. The guns were hot. He pushed the stick forward and dove toward the valley. The world tilted. The mountains rose on either side. The road appeared below, a thin ribbon of dirt winding through the green. And on that road, trucks. Dozens of them. Moving slowly, packed close together. Target acquired, Antonio said. Aztec 2, Aztec 3, take the lead vehicles. Aztec 4, Aztec 5, middle section. 6, 7, 8, rear. I'll take command vehicle. On my mark. He dove lower, the thunderbolt screaming through the air. The trucks grew larger. He could see soldiers now, tiny figures scrambling, pointing up. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from the mountainside, black puffs of smoke, tracers arcing toward him. Mark. Antonio pressed the trigger. The rockets leaped from the wings, trailing smoke. They struck the lead truck and it exploded, a ball of orange fire that consumed the vehicles behind it. He pulled up hard, the G-forces pressing him into his seat, and released his bombs. They tumbled through the air and detonated in the middle of the convoy, tearing the road apart. Around him, the other thunderbolts attacked. Explosions rippled along the convoy. Trucks burned. Soldiers ran. The anti-aircraft fire intensified, filling the sky with metal and fury. Aztec leader, I'm hit. The voice was Sergeant Lopez, his plane trailing smoke. Can you make it back? I think so. Controls are sluggish but responding. Head for base. Aztec 6, escort him. Copy, leader. Antonio banked hard and came around for the second pass. The convoy was chaos now, burning vehicles, craters in the road, bodies scattered like broken dolls. But the anti-aircraft guns were still firing, still tracking. Strafing run. Watch for ground fire. He dove again, lower this time, so low he could see the faces of the soldiers looking up. He pressed the trigger and the 8.50 caliber machine guns roared, tearing through metal and flesh. The thunderbolt shuddered with the recoil. Tracers reached up toward him, missing by inches. Then he was past, climbing hard, the valley falling away behind him. Aztec Squadron, report. One by one, they checked in. All except Lopez, who was already limping back to base with Aztec 6 on his wing. Mission complete, Antonio said. Form up and head home. They climbed into the clear morning sky and turned west. Below, the convoy burned, black smoke rising in columns that could be seen for miles. The Japanese supply line was broken. The American advance would continue. But Antonio didn't feel triumph. He felt only the weight of what they'd done, the lives they'd taken, the violence they'd unleashed. War was not glorious. It was necessary. There was a difference. They landed at Clark Air Base as the sun reached its zenith. The ground crews cheered as the planes touched down. Colonel Morrison was waiting on the tarmac, along with a group of American officers and a photographer. Antonio climbed out of his cockpit and removed his helmet. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline draining away, leaving only exhaustion. Morrison approached and extended his hand. Outstanding work, Captain. Your squadron performed flawlessly. Antonio shook his hand. One of my men was hit. I heard. He made it back safely. The plane's damaged but he's fine. Antonio nodded. Around him, his pilots were climbing out of their planes, their faces drawn, their eyes distant. They'd crossed a line today. They'd gone into combat and come back. They were different now. They would always be different. The photographer took pictures. The American officers congratulated them. Someone mentioned a commendation. Antonio heard the words but didn't process them. He was thinking about the convoy, about the trucks exploding, about the soldiers running. He was thinking about how easy it had been to kill them. That night, the Aztec Eagles gathered in the barracks. No one spoke much. They sat on their bunks, cleaning their weapons, writing letters, staring at nothing. The euphoria of survival had faded, replaced by something quieter, heavier. Antonio walked among them, checking on each man. They all said they were fine. They were all lying. But that was okay. Lying was how you survived. Lying was how you kept going. He found Captain Perez Tagle sitting outside, smoking a cigarette, looking at the stars. "How are you?" Antonio asked. "I don't know," Perez Tagle said. "I thought I'd feel different. I thought it would mean something." "It does mean something." "What?" Antonio sat down beside him. "It means we did what we came here to do. It means we didn't freeze. It means we're still here." Perez Tagle took a drag on his cigarette. "My brother died on a beach in France. I always wondered what his last moments were like. If he was afraid. If he thought about home. If it hurt. And now I know he was probably too busy to think about any of that. War doesn't give you time to be philosophical. It just happens, and you react, and then it's over and you're either alive or you're not." Antonio nodded. "That's the truth of it." They sat in silence, watching the stars. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. The war continued. It would continue tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until there was nothing left to fight over or no one left to fight. "We fly again in 2 days," Antonio said. "I know. Are you ready?" Perez Tagle smiled, a thin, tired smile. "Does it matter?" "No. I suppose it doesn't." The missions continued. Over the next 2 months, the Aztec Eagles flew 59 combat sorties. They attacked Japanese positions in the mountains of Luzon. They provided air support for American ground forces. They bombed supply depots, strafed convoys, destroyed bridges. They lost no planes to enemy fire, though several returned with damage. They earned the respect of the American pilots, who stopped seeing them as symbols and started seeing them as brothers. And then, on August 15, 1945, the war ended. Antonio was in the operations room when the announcement came over the radio. Japan had surrendered. The Emperor had spoken. The fighting was over. He stood perfectly still, listening to the words repeat. Around him, American officers cheered, embraced, opened bottles of whiskey they'd been saving for this moment. The noise was deafening. But Antonio felt nothing. No joy. No relief. Just a vast, empty silence. He walked outside. His pilots were gathering on the tarmac, their faces confused, uncertain. They'd prepared for more missions. They'd prepared to keep fighting. They hadn't prepared for it to simply end. "It's over," Antonio said. The words felt strange in his mouth. "What do we do now?" Lieutenant Perez asked. Antonio looked at the P-47s sitting silent in the sun. He looked at his men, these boys who'd become soldiers, who'd flown into fire and come back changed. He looked at the sky, clear and blue and empty of threat. "Now we go home," he said. 3 weeks later, the Aztec Eagles boarded a transport plane at Clark Air Base. They were going home. Back to Mexico. Back to their families. Back to lives that would never quite fit the same way again. Antonio sat by the window as the plane lifted off. Below, the Philippines grew smaller, the jungles and mountains and battlefields shrinking into abstraction. He thought about the missions they'd flown, the targets they'd destroyed, the lives they'd taken. He thought about the waiting, the frustration, the doubt. He thought about the moment when everything changed, when the war finally found them and they proved they belonged. And he thought about what came next. Because the war was over, but its weight remained. It would remain for the rest of their lives. They would carry it in their dreams, in their silences, in the way they flinched at sudden noises. They would carry it in the knowledge that they'd done something terrible and necessary, and that both things could be true at the same time. The plane climbed higher. The Pacific stretched below, endless and blue. Antonio closed his eyes and saw the future, the return to Mexico City, the parades, the speeches, the photographs. The slow, painful process of becoming civilians again. the realization that no one who hadn't been there could truly understand what they'd experienced. But they would have each other. The 33 men of Squadron 201. The Aztec Eagles. They would carry the weight together, the way they'd flown together, fought together, survived together. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could ask. Antonio opened his eyes. Beside him, Major Espinosa was reading a letter from his wife. Across the aisle, Captain Perez Tagle stared out the window, his face unreadable. Behind them, the younger pilots talked quietly, their voices subdued, already beginning the long process of making sense of what they'd done. The plane flew west, toward home, toward Mexico, toward a future that was uncertain but at least was theirs. Antonio reached into his pocket and pulled out the stack of letters he'd written to his wife. He'd mail them when they landed. She would read them and understand, or she wouldn't. Either way, he would tell her the truth, that he'd kept his promise. That he'd brought his men home. That he'd done what he set out to do. And that it had cost him something he couldn't name, something he'd left behind in the jungles and mountains of the Philippines, something he would never get back. But that was the price of war. That was what it meant to fight. You gave up pieces of yourself, and you hoped that what remained was enough to build a life on. The sun set over the Pacific, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Antonio watched the light fade and felt something shift inside him, not peace, exactly, but acceptance. The war was over. They had survived. And that would have to be enough. Because there was nothing else. Just the weight, the memory, and the certainty that they had done what needed to be done. The plane flew on through the gathering darkness, carrying 33 men toward home, toward rest, toward whatever came after war. And Captain Antonio Cardenas Rodriguez closed his eyes and let himself believe, for just a moment, that courage had been enough after all.